expressing gratitude, there are two levels. There's one level where you're just grateful to someone for all that they've given you. And you just say thank you for everything. But the real test of gratitude is where you can actually pinpoint specific benefits that you get and that you could show your gratitude for them, for each individual one separately. So then when we wake up in the morning after thanking God for restoring our soul to us, we then recite specific blessings, each one designed to express our thanks to God for individual benefits that we have, benefits of our bodily health, benefits for the different aspects of our soul, benefits for just waking up in the morning and hearing the rooster crow so we know it's day, to distinguish between day and night, for our clothing. In the last class we discussed the blessing where we thank God for girding Israel with strength. And we went into great length explaining different aspects of the strength that we have, mostly the moral strength that we have to deal with all the challenges that we will have to meet once we leave our home. Because all the blessings, the way they were designed, at least in the Chabad formulation of them, is they go from the time you wake up until you get out of the house, and you have to meet the challenges of the day. So before you go out, you have to be girded with strength, the ability to withstand the pressures that come from the outside, external pressures, and also the internal pressures. Once we finish expressing our gratitude for the strength that we have, that God gives us, we now thank God for something in addition. And the blessing reads, traditional opening of a blessing is Baruch Atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, blessed are you God, our God, King of the universe. And here's the last three words are the key parts of the blessing. Oter Yisrael B'Sifara, who crowns Israel with glory. Thanking God for crowning us with glory. And that's a very ambiguous statement. What exactly is that referring to? Well, according to most opinions, this refers to our head covering. That when you go outside and you put on your hat, you have to thank God that you have the hat with which to protect your head. But if that was the only meaning of the blessing, it would raise a question, two questions actually. Question number one would be, didn't we already thank God, Malbish Arumim, who clothes the naked? So if we need a hat, what's the difference between the hat and all the other clothing? Why is it a separate blessing? Question number two, why does it add the word Yisrael, Israel, who crowns Israel with glory? Why is that related to Israel in particular? We don't say Malbish Yisrael, that God clothes Israel, the naked of Israel. We don't say God opens the eyes of Israel, because God opens everyone's eyes and God clothes everyone. There's nothing unique about Israel in terms of their eyes being opened and their clothing being provided for them. So why over here do we use the term Yisrael? Actually, there's a third question. What does it mean with glory? Why is putting on a hat an expression of glory? You should just say, God gives us a head covering. It would have been very simple to put it that way. So because of all these questions, some of them are stated, some of them are implied, the different commentators come up with different nuances of this blessing. But just to connect it to the preceding blessing, I think there's a very simple way of understanding it. That's also a deeper way of understanding it. When we said that God girds Israel with strength, strength means the ability to withstand the negative. And we always have to be appreciative of what we have in terms of being able to avoid being influenced by negative influences. But it's not enough just to withstand the negative. Sometimes we get so caught up with fighting evil that to some people that seems to be the only goal in life, to withstand the pressures, to fight negativity and evil. And they forget that God put us in this world not just to fight evil, but more importantly, to increase the good. So after we thank God for giving us the strength to be able to carry on our mission without opposition, not to be disturbed and distracted by the opposition, we then focus on what is our positive goal. And our positive goal is not just to have strength, but to have beauty and glory. God crowns us with beauty and glory, that when we go out to the world, we don't only look at the world as our enemy, and that we are able to defend ourselves, but we are able to project an atmosphere of royalty, of glory and beauty. And we'll get more into that as we go on. The source of this blessing is in the Talmud. The Talmud, when it goes through all the different morning blessings, says, when one puts on his head covering, he recites the blessing, which ends with the words, who crowns Israel with glory. And the Avudraham, one of the early commentators who explains the different parts of the prayer book, cites several biblical verses where we find the word crowning, that God crowns us. One place it says, he crowns me with kindness and mercy. In another place it says, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified, so that we know that we glorify God and God glorifies us. And there are various other verses that associate glory with a crown, but that's a very amorphous understanding of this blessing. There's more to it than just a head covering, as I said before. But it certainly does include the head covering. So why is that such an important thing? So the Avudraham, the same classic commentator I just mentioned, explains that there is a requirement that Jewish people have to cover their heads and not to go bareheaded. And he explains that this is a uniquely Jewish type of behavior. And the reason, he says, is because the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rests on the Jewish person. And where does it rest? The Zohar says it rests on their head. It hovers over their head. So by covering your head, you're acknowledging the presence of the divine over your head. And that's a uniquely Jewish experience. As other commentators point out, I believe it's the Lavush, a 16th century authority of Jewish law and also Kabbalist, that while others wear head coverings to protect them from the elements, Israel, the Jewish people, wear a head covering as a way of showing awareness that there's something above our heads, someone, namely God, the Shekhinah, the divine presence that rests on us. The Meiri, one of the early commentators going back about 750 years, explains that the head covering is a sign or a symbol of freedom. In the olden days, slaves would have to go bareheaded. They were not allowed to cover their heads. If you covered your head, that was a sign that you were a free person. So we have a little bit of a different nuance over here. Number one, the head covering is a symbol that we're aware of the divine presence. Number two, the head covering is a symbol of our freedom. Now, let's try to reconcile these two explanations because they sound like they're mutually exclusive. They're contradictory. On one hand, we're saying we're not in control of everything. There's a God above us, our master, and we're aware that we are below and beneath that higher authority. And then we say it's a symbol of our freedom. But if we really examine what the word freedom means, we will discover that not only are these not two opposite and contradictory ideas, but they are complementary. Because what is the definition of freedom? Freedom does not mean that a person is capable of doing whatever he or she wants. That's not the definition of freedom. The definition of freedom is two things that are lacking in the classic definition, the conventional definition. Number one, freedom means that you have all the options open to you. If someone tells you, you're in the Soviet Union, and they say, you're going for the elections, you can vote for Brezhnev in the olden days, or you could choose to vote for Brezhnev. You have that choice. Well, obviously that wasn't much of a choice. Even if they told you you can either vote for him or not vote for him, that was not much of a choice. When you know that you have all the different options open, and then you choose whichever one you want, that's called freedom. But if you don't have all the options, don't delude yourself to think you're free. Number two, freedom really means that you're free to choose what you deep down really want. Not what you think you want. Not what society imposes on you, telling you this is what you must want. That if someone in France, in Paris, or Rome decides that fashion has to be a certain way, this is how women should get dressed, for example, and it's always a man who designs it for them, and imposes it on them, and you say, well, I'm free to dress any way I like. No, you're not free, because number one, you don't know the other options. You don't have the option of modesty, because it wasn't taught to most people. What most people are exposed to are the standards of the secular and very immoral society. So you don't even have all the options. And even if you know about modesty, you don't. Most people who don't choose that way, it's not because they studied it and they understand it, it's because they ignored it. They didn't even think about it as an option. And the second thing is, what does a person, and particularly a Jew, really want? Well, it depends what you mean by really want. If you're talking about their body, if you're talking about their animal soul, yes, it has a lot of desires. But if you're talking about the essence of who we are, our godly soul definitely wants a relationship with God and everything that has to be done in order to make that relationship a really solid one. So let's go back again. When we're talking about the two different interpretations of what it means to cover our heads. One interpretation means that there's a God above us to whom we are subservient and we follow whatever he tells us. And the other explanation, which we thought was the opposite, is it's a symbol of freedom. The two are not mutually exclusive. They're supportive of one another, because what is true freedom when you do what you really want? Deep down, your neshama, your soul, wants nothing less than a relationship with God, and covets and cherishes and savors that relationship. It's the most enjoyable, most exciting, the most meaningful thing that a person can do in terms of what your neshama, your soul feels, is to have that relationship. Now, if you are ignorant of that, because your soul is not really getting his message through because the body and the animal soul are covering up, then what happens? What happens is that you're exposed to a very narrow field of choices. And you choose to, and you think you're doing something that you want to do, but deep down that's not what you want to do. You're not even aware that that's what you want to do. You don't have all the choices. So true freedom means that you are totally aware and you give equal time to the godly soul's desires as you do to the animal soul's desires. You know, many people talk about educating their children, and I heard this many times from parents, and they say, well, I'm going to not talk to my children about God and religion. I'm going to educate them with a neutral approach to God and religion. When they get older, when they're 18 years old and they're adults, they can choose. So that way they're going to be exposed to, they're going to have real choice. And the obvious response to that is you're giving them no choice because you're totally inculcating them and indoctrinating them with a secular, godless, non-spiritual, non-religious way of looking at life. How do you expect them in those most formative years to be able to have their godly soul be cultivated and nurtured? So their godly soul is being buried. Every time you neglect to feed it with what it needs, you're burying it, you're causing it to become malnourished. And when someone is malnourished, if they're still alive, they're in a dead faint, they're unconscious, and they can hardly even make their presence known. So parents, in order to give their children free choice, shouldn't even give them equal time for religion and for secular life. Because unfortunately, the animal soul within us and the bodily needs are much more capable of expressing what they want than the soul. So it's never going to be a fair battle. You have to overcompensate and give the soul more than what you would think would be equal in order for it to actually be equal. So after having said that, we could summarize by saying that this blessing is thanking God for our ability to have this awareness that there's something above us. And the second thing is to appreciate that we have true freedom. Let's go a little bit more into the reason for head covering, the basic reason. According to the Talmud and Zohar, and this is already alluded to by the words of Avudraham, The reason we cover our heads is to acknowledge an awareness of God and to generate reverence for Him. Because, unfortunately, human beings worship their intellect. This is how we are exposed to, this is what we are exposed to in the secular world. That the highest thing in life is to reach the highest levels of intellectual achievement. And that ultimately the mind will fathom all that there is to know and attain the knowledge of the universe, and we will know everything. And that if your mind is advanced, you are in control of your world, you are in control of your life. And there's a lot of truth to that, that the power of the mind is incredible. But Judaism says that's not the truth. The truth is that there's something above our mind, something above our intellect. And if one is objective enough and humble enough, one could see that that is the case even through the prism of the mind. You don't need faith for this. In the 19th century, scientists were convinced that after the advances that they made, initial advances in the Industrial Revolution, they thought that on a scale of 1 to 100, let's say, they have the knowledge of 1, and maybe in due time, with all the efforts that were being expended in that direction, we will reach 100. We will know everything there is to know. 20th century scientists have reached the level not of 100, but of 1,000. And now they realize that the scale is not 1 to 100 or 1 to 1,000, it's 1 to 1,000,000,000,000. That means the more science and the more scholars know, the more they realize that there's so much more that they don't know, which leads to the conclusion, the inevitable conclusion, that the more we know, the smarter we become, the more distant the goal becomes, and the goal becomes totally beyond our reach. It grows exponentially. So even if we would live another 1,000,000,000,000 years and every member of this planet would devote himself to total scientific research, we would be extremely intelligent. We can't even imagine. We would know nothing compared to what there is to know. So the mind itself has to come to the conclusion that there's something above the mind, but that's not how it happens. The mind usually gives the person greater ego. The smarter a person is, the more their ego grows, and the more their ego grows, the less moral they will become. So in order to protect ourselves, it's not enough just to have the belt that we spoke about last week. We gird ourselves with strength, separation between the upper part of the body and the lower part. We have to make sure that our mind is not deified, is not glorified as the ultimate, that there's something above the mind. They tell a story of a man, very wealthy, arrogant man from the United States, was visiting Jerusalem, and he wasn't wearing a head covering, and he was visiting a very religious neighborhood, and a little kid goes over to him and he says, Mister, I don't see your head covering. And he looks at the kid scornfully and he says, the sky is my yarmulke, is my head covering. To which the little child responds, in Yiddish, Azar Greise yarmulke for Hazar kleine Nikop. Such a big head covering for such a tiny little head. What the kid said is really very powerful truth. That no matter how smart we are, our heads are tiny. And we have to recognize that. And the only way you can recognize that is when you see that there's something above you that is infinitely great. What are the reasons that we put on a head covering? Well, one reason we just mentioned is to make sure that we're aware there's something above us. There's another reason given by some halachic authorities of Jewish law, that there's a commandment in the Torah, you should not follow non-Jewish customs that are rooted in non-Jewish ways of thinking. And of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything that anyone else does, because then we couldn't eat supper either. We couldn't be dressed because other people dress. It means things that have been instituted by other nations that are at variance with our value system, with our perspectives on life. I don't know how accurate this is, but this is what I've heard, that the reason why in non-Jewish circles taking off the hat is a sign of respect, which has become a very non-Jewish way of showing respect. In fact, when I grew up, you couldn't walk into a library with your hat on. It's enough that you wore a yarmulke. That they tolerated. In some places, they would even frown if you walked in with a yarmulke, because it seemed like you were disrespectful. But Judaism says no, you show respect by putting on your hat. So I once heard this explanation that the reason why they took off their hats to show respect, because in the olden days, the knights were covered with head armor, and you didn't know if the person was friend or foe. So when two people would meet and they would want to show that they're not ready to kill the other, they would take off their head covering and expose their heads to the other, as if to say, I'm safe, you're safe, let's be friends. In Judaism, that's not considered to be a valid way of showing respect, because that whole concept of we are all potential enemies is far into the Jewish mindset. I once heard a similar explanation why in secular circles, it's only observed in Hasidic circles, men in other circles button their jackets left over right. Women do right over left, men do left over right. But in Hasidic tradition, we do right over left. And the reason for why they used to do left over right is because if you have to take your sword out of the scabbard, and if you're right-handed, as most people are, it would be very difficult. You'd have to unbutton your jacket before you can take the sword out. So by having it left over right, you could just pull the sword out without any... That is the manifestation of a violent culture that the Jewish people were obviously not into. And on the contrary, our sign of respect is by covering your head, showing humility. And when you show humility, you don't have to be worried that you're going to be a victim of the other person's violence, or you're going to be victimizing the other person. Another reason why we cover our heads, in addition to showing awareness of the God that's above us, in addition to the fact that it's a patently non-Jewish custom and tradition, is a third reason of modesty. That since it's something that we generally do cover, uncovering it would be a lack of modesty. And that goes back to the first reason. Modesty has two sides to it. One side of modesty is covering up parts of the body that are normally expected to be covered. The other part of modesty is like humility, where you respect a higher authority. Well, we're always in the presence of a higher authority, so we always have to show modesty. There's a deeper meaning, another dimension to this blessing. Initially, most opinions believe that this blessing is recited because of the head covering, that is the sign of our reverence for God. Some authorities say that just for a plain head covering wouldn't warrant a special blessing. It would be included in the blessing for clothing in general. But it's the type of head covering. When you wear a mitznefes, a turban in the olden days, or a distinguished looking hat that gave you glory, that gave you respectability, that's what this blessing is for. And the spiritual side of that is that we're thanking God not just for protecting us, giving us strength, but also according to us a status of royalty. And when we walk down the street, as humble as we have to be, we have to know that we are kings. We are chosen by God to be masters of our environment, masters of our own behavior, but masters of the world in a positive way, not as a master race, God forbid, but as a people who are able to see what God's purpose is with creation and cultivating the world to make the world a kinder and a more gentle place, a world that is receptive to goodness and kindness and receptive ultimately to God's presence. So that's what we're thanking God that God gives us the opportunity to go outside looking regal and royal. In the Code of Jewish Law, it cites that Rabbeinu Asher, one of the greatest halachic authorities of about 600 years ago, that he would put on his tefillin right before this blessing. That means that he would also have in mind that God crowns us with glory, referring to his tefillin, specifically the head tefillin, because the head tefillin is the crown and the glory of the Jewish people. The Talmud says, and I mentioned this last week, that the nations of the world will see that God's name is called upon us, and they will fear you. They will respect you. And the Talmud says Rabbi Eliezer, this refers to the tefillin that we put on our heads. That God gives us the tefillin as a way of eliciting the respect from the nations of the world, because tefillin themselves have God's name on them, written in them, and on the outside it has the letters of God's name. And when the nations of the world see that we carry God's name on us, we have this crown, this divine crown, they will revere us, they will respect us, and in some cases, where necessary, they will fear us. The story is told of the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad leader, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who was wearing his tefillin when a Russian officer noticed it and was terrified and started shivering and shaking. And someone asked the Alter Rebbe what caused that, and it says in the Talmud that when the nations of the world see tefillin on their heads, they will fear you. So the man asked the Alter Rebbe, but when I wear tefillin, no one fears me. It doesn't work. So the Alter Rebbe said the expression in the Talmud that is used, not tefillin on the head, tefillin in the head. That it's not enough, although that's the essential mitzvah, to put the tefillin physically on our head, between our eyes. We have to see to it that the message of tefillin infiltrates and becomes a part of our way of thinking, that we think tefillin, we think divinely, we think royally and regally, and that's what commands the respect of the nations. And for that we're grateful here as well. We say this blessing on Shabbos, even though we don't wear tefillin on Shabbos, because the blessing is not just for the tefillin, it's for all of the different aspects of our head covering and what they symbolize. Then there's a mystical dimension to this blessing. The last two blessings we discussed, that after God gives us strength that is internalized within us, there's also another type of influence and inspiration that encompasses us, because we have our soul that comes in two parts. There's part of the soul that is within the body, and a part of the soul that is beyond the body, that encompasses it, that we are affected by it by being in its aura, but it cannot be internalized within us. The problem with the part of the soul that is internalized within us is that it's occupying space together with an animal soul, which clouds the radiance of the godly soul. It's contained within a body, so the body further obscures its light and its influence. That's why we need to also have the enveloping, encompassing influence of the soul that is above and beyond the body, which serves to enhance our spiritual integrity and protects us in ways, it enhances us in ways that the soul within the body cannot. Well, there are three levels. The human being consists of three parts. There's the lowest part of the body, the legs, the feet, then there's the torso, and then there's the head. The legs represent action. In order for our action to be guided in a spiritual way, we have this encompassing aura that was represented by the blessing that referred to the shoes. God takes care of all of our needs, which we understood was a meaning and a reference to the shoes that are the lowest, on the lowest part of our body, and represent action. And there's the encompassing force that surrounds our power of action. Then the torso, which houses the heart, the seat of emotion. In order for our emotions to be tamed and spiritualized and to be godly emotions, without being affected by the animal soul. We need this encompassing aura that was represented by the blessing. God girds us with strength. But then comes the intellect. The intellect poses a very important and a formidable challenge, because intellect is not the ultimate in terms of understanding even divine knowledge, because the intellect looks at the knowledge from an intellectual vantage point and cannot absorb the godly dimension of it. That for that we need this all-encompassing, transcendent force that is mentioned here and indicated here in this blessing, the crown of glory that envelops our head, that allows the godly dimension of the knowledge that we have to filter through and infiltrate our secular, mundane way of thinking, so that our mind becomes godly, that our mind is able to be receptive to the divine. So in summary, this blessing, we thank God for crowning Israel with glory, is a blessing about the fact that we have a head covering, that it's not just a protection for our head, but it's a protection for our awareness of God's presence. It's also a special garment that gives us glory and treats us and renders us more than just ordinary people. We're very special. It points to our chosenness. And then the tefillin that we wear is the ultimate sign of glory. And then there is the encompassing aura and light that we're thankful to God that He furnishes us with, so that we could develop and enhance our intellect from becoming a human intellect to a divine intellect. God willing, next week we'll continue with the next blessing. Thank you for joining us and participating in this class.